A subscriber, Thomas Schaefer, sent me a huge hoard of cars for me to make videos on. In this shipment was this really cool Matchbox car hauler. I'm going to do a restoration of this car hauler in the future, but wanted to focus on a specific issue in this video. I happen to have the same car hauler in my collection, and if we look at the back, you'll see what is wrong with the car hauler Thomas sent me. It's missing its ramp. Since my model still has its ramp, I want to remove it and then duplicate it for the broken car hauler. The ramp is held in place with this long pin. I can remove this pin by grinding off the mushroom head with a Dremel and a small grinding wheel. While I hate modifying anything on this perfectly good model, I feel I'll be able to repair it after I've made my duplicate. With any luck, I'll be able to re-mushroom the pin and no one will ever know that it's ever been removed. The part is fairly simple, albeit very thin. I plan to cast this in aluminum. The part has several 90-degree angles. Given how thin and small the part is, I'm going to come in and reinforce these areas in modeling clay. Experience in casting small parts like this has taught me that the sand tends to stick to these areas, ruining my mold. As mentioned before, the part is long and thin. Adding material anywhere will help in getting a good cast. I will also need to cover the holes where the pin came through, as I will not be able to cast those holes into the new part. Casting in metal can be a pretty expensive hobby if you're making large parts. However, casting small parts for die-cast cars is quite reasonable in comparison. The most expensive part you'll need is the 2-port quick kiln, which you can purchase from sites like eBay. Expect to pay around $130 for the kiln alone, and upwards of $200 if you want a kit which includes a lot of accessories. Beyond the kiln you'll need 2 torches. The small cheap variety like I have here work fine. The 2 rods to the right are graphite rods and will allow you to stir the molten metal. You will also need some type of metal tongs that will let you pick up the crucible. I went ultra cheap on the crucible and made one from a steel threaded coupling and an end cap, costing less than $5. The thick steel walls of this crucible will help hold in the heat and keep the aluminum molten during the pour. The last item is a metal spoon to pull out the dross that floats to the top. The kiln setup is pretty simple. You can start up both torches and then place them in the 2 ports. You can then use small stones to keep the torches from rolling. Once both torches are going, you can place the crucible in the kiln with the tongs. You can allow the crucible to heat up and then add the aluminum, or add it now. There are tons of different aluminum sources you can use. However, the best is to use aluminum that has already been cast, old hard drives for example. However, any source will work, and I'll admit to going to the hardware store and buying aluminum rods just to get a project going. So while the aluminum is brought to temp, I'll go about making my mold. So each part you cast will have a different setup from the last. One of the nice things about casting metal is that the mold is only temporary. Unlike casting in silicone, you can keep recreating your mold until you get the placement and setup just right, as everything is reusable. The first step is to cover the part with a little baby powder. This will act like a release agent for the part. It's also a good idea to add a little to the table or work surface you'll be building your mold on. The 2-part mold I like to use are these cast iron flask molds. These molds have the riser built into the mold, which is very helpful. One side of the mold has metal indexing pegs, while the other only has holes. It's this pegless side that you want to start with by laying it over the part with the open side of the riser against the work surface. Try to place the part near the top, as the further down you place it will give the metal more time to cool. Next I'll begin adding the sand. This sand is called Petrobond sand and is used in jewelry making. You can purchase it from places like eBay. It can produce very fine detail. I'm using a sifter to make sure no large chunks fall onto the part, which can cause casting issues. Running it through the sifter will remove these larger clods. Once the part is well covered with the sifted sand, I can go ahead and start adding the sand without sifting it. I use a small square block of wood to tamp the sand into place. You want the sand to compress around the part, and it doesn't take much pressure to get this done. After I have tamped down the sand, I'll use the wood block to smooth the top of the mold. I can now set this mold aside and clean up my workspace. Then using a stiff bristled brush, I can start removing the sand around the part. Every part you do will be different, but I want to remove the sand to about halfway through the part. This will help me remove the part later. Once I have the part cleaned up, I tamp the sand around it using my finger. I'll then add some more baby powder to the mold and use a brush to spread it around. This powder will allow the 2 halves of the mold to separate later and is very important. Forgetting to add it will ruin your work thus far. After the powder has been spread out, I can add the other mold half. Just as before, I'll sift sand onto the part, and then add more sand and then tamp down the mold. With the sand tamped into the two halves of the mold, I can now pull one side off. This needs to be done with an upwards motion, as you don't want to drag the mold half across the part, destroying the mold. If done correctly and with some luck, the half will come up with the impression intact. Next, I need to remove the part. Here I use a handle of the paintbrush to tap the part. This helps dislodge it from the sand. Small detailed parts like this are very hard to dislodge, so you may find that you need to use some wire or some other thin instrument to help dislodge it. You may have noticed that some of the sand came up with the part. In many cases this can ruin the mold. However, in this case it's not too bad and will show up as flashing that I can remove later. I now need to create some channels in the mold. At the top of the mold and between the part and the riser, I need to create a small channel for the molten metal to go through. I want to make this as big as possible without messing up the part. I use a clay tool to remove the sand, however any sharp item will work. After this channel has been created, I will then use a wire on all four corners of the part to make channels to the side of the mold. These channels are air channels and will allow air to escape the mold as it fills up with molten metal. With the air channels made, I can now clamp the mold together and it's ready for the pour. Make sure whatever clamp you use doesn't have any plastic pads. This mold will get very hot and melt any non-metallic objects it comes in contact with. My quick kiln is up to heat now and the initial metal has melted. I can now add more metal to the crucible. It's always better to have too much than not enough. Now is a good time to talk a little bit about safety. While the amount of metal I am melting here is pretty small and thus not nearly as dangerous as pouring a large amount of metal, the danger is still very real. The most dangerous thing that might happen is if I was to drop the crucible, causing the molten metal to splash out. If any splashing metal gets into your eye, it could blind you, so be sure to wear safety glasses. Have a bunch of water next to you just in case. Make sure you're wearing cotton, as synthetic fibers can melt and permanently adhere to your skin. Most importantly, don't allow your safety gear to give you a false sense of security. This molten aluminum will burn through a 1x4 in a few seconds. It can make it through a pair of jeans like they weren't even there. After pulling off the dross with a spoon and letting the kiln come back to heat after adding the aluminum, I'm finally ready for the pour. Notice that I have the mold next to the kiln. This is both for safety and to limit how much heat is lost from the crucible after I pull it from the kiln. The pour itself is done with one motion and poured as fast as I can control it safely. I pour the metal all the way up the riser. This will cause a downward pressure on the metal, pushing it through the mold. I'll need to let the mold cool for at least a few minutes before I can remove the part without damaging it. That being said, the cast iron parts of the mold are crazy hot and will be for the next hour, so do take care not to burn yourself on the mold. Once the part is removed, I can inspect it to see if I had a good cast. Here you can see that this casting is a failure. The molten aluminum cooled off before it could completely fill in all the details. This is mostly due to the part being so thin. The mold cools the metal off in the thin areas as there's just not enough molten metal to keep the aluminum liquid. This problem is going to keep showing up for me on this part. I tried modifying the mold in several different ways, but was never able to get a good cast. So, at my wit's end, I decided to fix the problem by making changes to the part. The change for this part is very simple and involves using more modeling clay to fill in the back of the part to give it more thickness. After this is done, the whole process was repeated just as you saw earlier. That small amount of additional thickness made all the difference and I was able to get a good cast for the first time. After pulling the part, I'll dunk it in some water to cool it off. I'll then use a hacksaw to remove the riser sprue from the part along with any flashing. Here's what the piece looked like right after the flashing was removed. From here on, it comes down to a lot of sanding, filing, and profiling of the part. The square hole was drilled and then filed, and quite a lot of filing was done to the back where I added the modeling clay. All of these steps will be detailed in the video I do on this car hauler. For now, I just want to show the process in a separate video so that it doesn't distract from the restoration video I plan to do later. I'm going to try and recast the part again in its thin form, as I have some ideas now that might work to fix the issues. If I succeed, then you will see that part in the future video. Otherwise, you'll see this part, which is now primed and ready for yellow paint. Well, I hope this video has been a help to you in your customs. Please do be careful if you plan to try it. If you do feel like you might hurt yourself, then I have another video where I cast using low temp metals that are much safer. I'll have a link to that video in this video and the description. Anyway, let me know your thoughts and ideas below, and as always, thanks for watching.